South Sudan came into existence in 2011, but deeply embedded in the history of its formation is the story of John Garang de Mabio, a Sudanese leader and former rebel commander of the Sudan People's Liberation Army, the SPLA. Garang was a charismatic military leader who spent more than 20 years at the helm of the SPLA and was really a thorn in the side of the Sudanese government, including that of the dictator Omar al-Bashir. Sudan had always been a troubled nation plagued by peripheral rebellions since before its birth in 1956. So John Garang thought he had the cure for this. He called it the New Sudan, a democratic, secular, and united nation where power and wealth would be shared across its vast landscape and diverse people, both Christians and Muslims, African and Arab. This was the cause that he and his group were fighting for, and what ensued was a brutal 22-year-long civil war which finally ended when the government of Sudan and John Garang signed the Comprehensive Peace Agreement. All of this was before John Garang's tragic death in July of 2005. In this episode of African Biographics, we look at the life story of John Garang, the Sudanese rebel leader of the SPLA. John Garang de Mabio was born in Buk, a tiny village of the Dinka people in Bor County on the east bank of the Nile River. He once said that no one in his village was even able to read. By the time he was 10 years old, he was orphaned and might have stayed in Bor County for the rest of his life, becoming a cattle herder like his father and grandfather before him. But his life changed when a relative sent him to school, first in the nearby Wau village, then across the Nile River in the village of Rumbek. In 1962, at the age of 17, young John attempted to join the Anyanya uprising in southern Sudan, but he was encouraged by its leaders to continue his secondary education in Tanzania. This was all during the First Sudanese Civil War, a 12-year conflict between the northern and southern regions of Sudan that had started in 1955. The Anyanya were a southern Sudanese separatist rebel army formed during this war. When he finished high school, young John won a scholarship to Grinnell College in Iowa in the United States, and in 1969 he graduated with a Bachelor of Science degree in economics. Garang was offered a graduate fellowship at the University of California at Berkeley, but instead he returned to Tanzania as a research fellow at the University of Dar es Salaam, but was soon back in Sudan with the Anyanya. Following the Addis Ababa Peace Agreement of 1972, when the then Sudanese president Hassan Aimeri brought the first phase of the civil war in Sudan to an end, Garang and members of the Anyanya were integrated into the Sudanese army. For the next 11 years, John Garang's career in the military saw him rise from captain to colonel, and he also completed an advanced course at the United States Army Infantry School in Fort Benning, Georgia. John Garang then took a 4-year break to study for a master's degree in agricultural economics and a PhD in economics at Iowa State University. Upon his return to Sudan in 1981, Garang found that the country had changed incredibly since the time he left, and here is why. In a bid to hold on to power as his popularity steadily declined, President Hassan Aimeri was trying to appease the Islamic fundamentalists by introducing Sharia law throughout the country, even in the predominantly Christian and animist South. Given what had transpired, Garang realized that the peace agreement of 1972 was doomed. At the same time, the company Chevron had discovered oil in Sudan in the southern regions. This was in the late 1970s. As a result of this, some northern politicians attempted to redraw provincial boundaries so that the oil fields could be relocated in the north. Unsurprisingly, the southerners were indeed disgruntled by all of this, and they felt that they had to do something. By 1982, there were renewed outbreaks of fighting in the south, with rebels mounting attacks upon the army. When an army mutiny took place at Bor County in the south, President Hassan Aimeri sent John Garang to quell this uprising. However, Garang instead swapped sides and formed the Sudan People's Liberation Movement, the SPLM, and their military wing, the SPLA. More than 2 months later, John Garang reappeared in Ethiopia, where the leader of the country at the time, Mengistu Haile Mariam, gave him and the SPLA full support, with the rebellious Boer garrison as the nucleus of this new movement. Mengistu's regime supported the cause of the Southern Sudanese in retaliation for the Sudanese government's support for Eritrean secessionists and Tigrayan rebels in Ethiopia who were causing trouble for Mengistu. Knowing that Mengistu was already fighting a separatist movement in Eritrea, Garang understood that his movement, the SPLA, could not style itself as separatist. Mengistu supported a united, secular and socialist Sudan. In Libya, Gaddafi, who had once supported the Eritreans but who switched sides when Mengistu came to power, joined Mengistu in supporting the Southern Sudanese. All this to say that the SPLA movement had strong backing from some powerful quarters. Anyways, Garang spent the rest of the year 1983 launching attacks by the SPLA against government targets in the south, and in turn was able to halt drilling for oil by Chevron, which had only recently commenced. Within a few months and even well into the middle of the 1980s, thousands of young Nuer and Dinka, the two largest ethnic groups in the south, joined Garang's SPLA and flocked to western Ethiopia for military training. The SPLA trained and deployed many battalions that captured scores of towns in Upper Nile and Equatoria, victories that resulted in more recruits from different ethnic groups in the south. In 1984, the SPLA set up a radio station in Ethiopia called Radio SPLA in order to broadcast into Sudan. John Garang gave his first radio address on the 3rd of March 1984, calling upon all the Sudanese people to abolish the divisions among them that the oppressor had imposed through the policy of divide and rule. This call for an inclusive Sudan ideologically appealed to marginalized Sudanese in the geographical northern Sudan and to some Arab intellectuals. That same year, 1984, by which time John Garang wanted to overthrow Nimeri and form a socialist government in Sudan, Khafa Nimeri attempted to appease John by offering him the vice presidency and making him coordinator of development in the south. But John Garang refused. On 16 April 1985, the Sudanese military, under General Suwa al-Dahab, mounted a coup and overthrew Khafa Nimeri. Following this, Garang ordered a ceasefire, but when he learned of Dahab's plan for the south, he renewed the war. A year later, in April of 1986, a civilian government under Sadiq al-Mahdi came to power. Sadiq al-Mahdi offered Garang a place on his Council of Ministers, but John Garang refused. Talks between Garang and Sadiq were held in Addis Ababa during July of 1986, but they did not reach any agreement. The SPLA regarded the so-called democratic period under Sadiq al-Mahdi as another northern dictatorship, and so the war raged on. In the years that followed, especially between 1986 and 1989, Garang made a number of territorial gains in the south, but the plight of the people there worsened, with many starving as a result of the war. The government in Khartoum also retaliated by recruiting militia forces to destabilize the civilian population in the south. In May of 1989, John Garang announced a one-month ceasefire so as to allow discussions about freezing the proposed imposition of Sharia law. However, this effort at finding a solution was thrown into disarray and eventually fell through following the 1989 coup d'etat, which brought General Omar al-Bashir to power. Al-Bashir and Dr. Hassan al-Turabi moved the country towards Islamic fundamentalism. Following this, John Garang made it clear that he didn't like the direction that al-Bashir and Turabi were taking the country, so the war continued. By 1990, the war was raging on, causing heavy human distress, and many thousands of refugees were created by the fighting. The SPLA also lost its chief financial backer when, in the spring of 1991, Mengistu's regime was overthrown by the Khartoum-backed Ethiopian rebels. Once the rebels had taken control in Ethiopia, they closed all SPLA training camps in Ethiopia and cut off the SPLA's arms supply, forcing the SPLA to return hundreds of thousands of Sudanese back to South Sudan. So Garang looked to the West for support, stressing the Christian character of much of the Sudanese South and Khartoum's efforts to impose Sharia law upon it. The misery of the South was further exacerbated by a resurgence of infighting between the rival factions of the SPLA. In August of 1991, an SPLA guerrilla commander from the newer ethnic group, Riek Machar, attempted to seize control of the SPLA from John Garang, but this was unsuccessful. There had been accusations that John Garang had become a dictator and was responsible for human rights abuses. So Riek Machar became a leader of a breakaway group known as the SPLA Nasir in 1991. Guerrilla forces led by Riek Machar, as well as a man by the name William Benny, soon began waging war against John Garang's SPLA. Riek Machar wanted independence for the South rather than a united secular Sudan that was favored by John Garang. Garang now had a reduced number of forces, but nevertheless he continued fighting. It is worth noting that ethnic rivalry seemed to have played a part in the dispute within the SPLA, with the SPLA Nasir faction mainly composed of the Nuer and Garang supporters mainly the Dinka people. Their struggle for power brought about a tribal split between the Dinka and Nuer lasting for many years. Tens of thousands of people were killed in this secondary war and several hundred thousands starved to death in the resulting famine. Both sides also conscripted child soldiers. Profiting from the split in the SPLA, the Khartoum government of Omar al-Bashir reached an agreement with Riek Machar, supplying him with weapons to fight John Garang and steering clear of combat areas that were under Riek Machar's control. In 1996, Riek Machar signed a political charter, and in 1997 he signed the Khartoum Peace Agreement with the government. Under this agreement, Riek Machar was assistant to Omar al-Bashir, and he was also made the president of the Southern States Coordinating Council. Riek Machar also became the commander-in-chief of the South Sudan Defense Force, which included most of the ex-rebels who had signed the Khartoum Agreement. These agreements, however, did not include Garang's faction of the SPLA, and John Garang continued the struggle. The war in the south was further complicated when neighboring governments, alarmed by Bashir's vision of a regional jihad emanating from Khartoum, retaliated by supporting the southern rebellion. Uganda acted as a major conduit for arms and ammunition for John Garang's forces. In response, Omar al-Bashir began to support rebel movements in northern Uganda, notably the Lord's Resistance Army led by one Joseph Kony. Riek Machar's agreements with the government collapsed only 3 years later. He resigned from his government post in February of 2000, accusing the government of having sent troops to fight his soldiers in the southern Wada state. A little while later, in January of 2002, John Garang and Riek Machar formally merged their forces and agreed on collective leadership on the basis that unity was paramount for the success of the liberation struggle. They stated that the combined movement would battle against genocide, ethnic cleansing, slavery, wanton looting of oil and natural resources, and displacement of southern people by non-indigenous settlers from the north. So after 6 years of on and off peace negotiations, the government and the Sudan People's Liberation Army signed a number of protocols in Naivasha, Kenya in January and May of 2004. These included a permanent ceasefire and the mechanism for implementing a peace agreement. This agreement came to be known as the Comprehensive Peace Agreement. The agreement was signed in January of 2005 and cemented when, on the 9th of July of the same year, John Garang was sworn in as the first vice president of the country, the second most powerful person in Sudan. following a ceremony in which he and President Omar al-Bashir signed a power-sharing constitution, officially ending a conflict that killed at least 2 million people. No Christian or Southerner had ever held such a high government post. Simultaneously, John Garang became the premier in southern Sudan. This administration in the south had limited autonomy for 6 years, at the end of which there will be a scheduled referendum regarding cessation of this territory. Both sides that signed the comprehensive peace agreement promised to make unity attractive in the interim. Under John Garang's lead, the SPLM-SPLA, although southern-based, had officially stayed a unionist party cultivating strong party structures across the north and the south. Just 3 weeks after John Garang assumed the post of first vice president, tragedy struck when he was involved in a fatal helicopter crash on his way back from Uganda. The Ugandan presidential helicopter that was carrying John Garang back to Sudan from a meeting with President Yoweri Museveni flew into bad weather. Government forces reported that the helicopter crashed into a mountain in the Amatonge range in southern Sudan, killing John Garang, 6 of his associates, and 7 Ugandan crew members. At the time of his death, John Garang de Mabio was 60 years old. Following this, some angry Garang supporters pointed fingers at Omar al-Bashir's government for involvement in his death. However, investigations appeared to indicate bad weather was responsible. 2 weeks before his death, John Garang had chosen Salva Kiir, a long-time SPLA leader, as his deputy. So following the death of John Garang, Salva Kiir took over as the head of the SPLA, SPLM, and president of South Sudan, and vowed to continue John Garang's work. However, the death of John Garang also marked the death of his New Sudan vision, as it was never institutionalized, and so the division of Sudan became inevitable. After Salva Kiir had become the chairman of the SPLA, SPLM, his focus shifted to the referendum in South Sudan. In 2011, South Sudan voted to secede from Sudan, becoming an independent country. There is no doubt that the name John Garang will forever be etched in the hearts of the people of South Sudan. Let me know in the comment section below what your thoughts are about John Garang and his New Sudan vision. Don't forget to like and share the video if you enjoyed it, and also if you are new here, then don't be shy to subscribe. Thank you all for tuning in. This has been Tatenda for African Biographics. Until next time, cheers. Have a good one.